Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. I'm also in Pennsylvania today, so I'm an East Coaster for the evening. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Welcome and many thanks to Ken Khachigian for joining us tonight. As a man who was in the room, not only with former presidents Reagan and Nixon, but with dozens of other critically important American political leaders, it will be very interesting to hear what tonight's guest believes former leaders of the GOP, most notably two past presidents, would say about today's Republican Party, and what would they say to President Trump. Welcome and thanks as well to tonight's wonderful moderator, Warren Olney. Our next two programs, just so you note, are not on Wednesdays. Tuesday next week, February 18th, former U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, Joyce Vance, who we often see on MSNBC or on NBC as a legal analyst. She will be in conversation with Pat Morrison next Tuesday, speaking about the American justice system, testing the limits. And a week from this Sunday at 10 a.m. in the morning, we have editor-in-chief of the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, Aluf Ben, in conversation also with Pat Morrison for our Israel in Crisis briefing number 22. We are living in complicated and perplexing times. We are so pleased to be able to offer an hour each week of in-depth, intelligent conversation with a wide array of the very best analysts, statespeople, journalists, and moderators. Our mission is to provide reliable, fact-based information to our audience and to help us all maintain our sanity and to inspire active engagement in preserving our democracy. Please invite others to join our program. All are welcome, and as you all know, it is free. We are about to end our 5th year and start our 6th year of programming. So you've all been wonderful supporters and a great audience, and we appreciate that. You look to the bottom of tonight's email that you'll get right after the program to register for all of our upcoming programs. I think there's 7 or 8 that you can be registering for now. Now, please welcome my friend and partner in this enterprise, former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, who will introduce more formally tonight's guest and our moderator. Zev?
Well, thank you, Janice, and good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, wherever you may be. We're privileged tonight to have as our guest Ken Khachigian. Ken was chief speechwriter, trusted political advisor, and favorite scribe to Ronald Reagan, and the go-to counsel for the president and the first lady in campaigns and political crises. Ken also served in Richard Nixon's White House. Among other things, he worked with Nixon as he emerged from the White House and from Watergate, and assisted with Nixon's legendary interviews with David Frost. Ken earned respect as California's premier Republican strategist in myriad elections, both statewide and nationally. He is an honors graduate of the University of California in Santa Barbara and earned his law degree from Columbia University. He recently authored this fascinating book that I thoroughly enjoyed reading, Behind Closed Doors, in the Room with Reagan and Nixon. It's an historically significant chronicle of the inner workings of two of the 20th century's most impactful presidents. He hails from an era when Republicans and Democrats fought, argued, negotiated, but ultimately found a way to reach common ground on many of the most pressing issues of the time. It's seemingly a long-gone era when substance, evidence, and the national interest often took precedence over talking points and scoring points. Ken will be in conversation tonight with our often and regular moderator, Warren Olney. Warren is an award-winning broadcast journalist and former NPR talk show host for many decades. And prior to that, he was a very accomplished television news reporter and anchorman. Warren is no stranger to America at a Crossroads, and I know we will look forward to tonight's conversation. Warren, it's all yours.
Yeah, thank you so very much, and thanks for those kind words. And Ken Khachigian, it's wonderful to have you with us, and thank you so much for being available. And of course, you've got a book coming out, so there's a good reason for that. And it's, as I've indicated, it's a fascinating volume. So you were behind closed doors, and you were in the room in different ways with two people. You describe it as a decade and a half of close confidential contact with two Republican presidents. For Nixon, you were young and fairly low-level staff person at the White House to begin with. For Reagan, you were a speechwriter, you were a political road warrior, that's another term of yours, But here's the connection: since since Nixon had to resign or face impeachment, there had to be, it couldn't be any public contact between the two of them, even though they were both Republicans. So you became part of what you called the best kept secret of Reagan's 1980 campaign. So tell us about that and how it worked and how you were a sort of catalyst between these two presidents.
Well, here's how it happened. Of course, after President Nixon resigned, I was asked by him to come to San Clemente to help with his memoirs. So I spent 4.5 years with him working on his memoirs, and then it was through him that I got introduced to President Reagan or Governor Reagan through his campaign consultant, Stu Spencer. And once I got hooked up into the campaign, it offered Nixon, who had been frustrated in the '76 campaign, where he couldn't advise either candidate with all the wisdom he had in politics and campaigning. And now he had an entree into the Reagan campaign. He was close to Reagan. He and Reagan, they liked each other back, going way back into the 40s and 50s and 60s. And now he had an entree through me. So while I was on the road with Nixon, with Reagan, throughout the '80 campaign, traveling with him throughout the country, Nixon would call me on the road, and I would keep notes that I would of information and pass them mainly through Stu Spencer and sometimes very infrequently through to Reagan or through Mike Deaver. But then as we got closer to the end of the campaign, Nixon, who had a very, very restless political mind, and as I was going to mention to you earlier, Nixon, when he was not involved in his own campaigns, and this is true of most politicians, with no offense to the politicians who might be listening, when politicians aren't involved in their own campaigns, they tend to be more detached and can give much more better advice. And in this case, Nixon started writing memos. And so he had his chief of staff, then Nick Ruey, contact me on the road. Because Nixon was still sort of red hot commodity in terms of he was sort of nuclear at the time, and we couldn't have anybody know that he was in contact with Reagan. So his chief of staff set up a secret meeting. So it was like a CIA person meeting with a KGB agent, and we met secretly in Kansas City. And he passed off in a secret packet the first memo from Nixon to Reagan in the '80 campaign. So throughout the '80 campaign, I became an intermediary that no one knew about between Nixon and Reagan in that campaign. And we ended up passing two very, very competent and detailed secret memos to Reagan from Nixon, plus all the conversations I had that I kept notes of.
You have appendices in the book, including many of those messages that Nixon sent to Reagan, and they're very detailed. Some of them go 7 or 8 pages long, narrowly typed, and they go into great detail in terms of the campaigns that he was running, in terms of the issues that he was looking at, in terms of how he might want to treat other politicians. It's really quite extraordinary. They were similar in age, but Nixon was the old pro when it came to politics, I guess. How did that affect their political standing as candidate? How did that make them different as presidents?
One thing I just want to go back to mention in terms of the advice Nixon gave, people might have thought that he would advise Reagan on foreign policy in that campaign. Actually, he advised Reagan to stay away from foreign policy and focus on economics throughout that campaign. But as to going back to your question, they really had an attachment to each other, going back to the fact that Reagan was very much supportive of Nixon during his presidency on 2 issues, on the Vietnam War and on Watergate. And I think it's because they were both Californians. They had a very similar upbringing, very modest upbringing, came from very, not totally impoverished backgrounds, but they had very similar upbringings in terms of how they were raised. and they were both children of the Depression and children of the 50s. And so they had a sort of mutual bonding with each other mentally and emotionally. And though they had different kinds of personalities, and I think they had sort of that bond that carried them through with each other, so that Reagan had an admiration for Nixon in terms of his thinking, and Nixon had a great admiration for Reagan in terms of the way how he communicated and how he looked at issues and how he communicated those issues. So it was really a very fascinating relationship.
Well, when Nixon wrote those memos and when he communicated with you and asked you to talk to Reagan, what do you think was his intent? Was he trying to shape the Reagan presidency in a way that he might have conducted it if he had stayed in office?
In the book, and I have to hawk it a little bit. I hope people will read the book. But I have I call him Coach Nixon. He saw Reagan as having such great, extraordinary talent. And a lot of times he was frustrated watching Reagan in his campaigns, and he felt that if he could just shape him and mold him a little bit with some political skills, he saw Reagan as having such extraordinary communicating skills and ability to reach people, but he didn't feel Reagan had nascent political talent in terms of the raw ability to separate and analyze issues, and that he could be someone who could coach him a little bit and how to reach people in that way in terms of policy wise. So I think his intent was to take someone who had all this great communicating talent and turn him into somebody who could just really change America. I don't think he had any specific interest in other than he wanted to be of great help. Now then later on, once Reagan got elected, I think he had some interest in trying to advise him on how to staff his cabinet and how to staff his presidency. And I think he just wanted to, some of it was to try to renew his own reputation and get back into the game. He missed being into the game, Warren. In San Clemente for those years from 74 to 79, and until he moved back to New York, he felt isolated and out of the political game and out of the national game. And now was this opportunity to get back into the mix, not just through Reagan, but partially through Reagan. And that was a great opportunity for him.
Well, was he trying to tell Reagan what issues to push and to shape his presidency in terms of its content as well as the strategy?
No, I don't think he would go that far. I just think in the campaign, I think the campaign was different. The campaign, I thought he wanted to shape the issues in terms of wanting to make sure that Reagan focused on the economy and stay away from foreign policy, because he thought on foreign policy issues and defense issues, Reagan had some weakness, that he was thought of as being too hardline, and that they had sort of not a madman quality, but that people saw him as a little too quick on the trigger. But that on the economy, Carter was extremely, extremely weak, and that he knew that that was a very soft spot for Carter then, and that Reagan had a great ability to exploit the economy on Carter. So he wanted to really push that issue for him.
So that was in 1980. But what about in subsequent advice and counsel that Nixon provided? And how did Reagan respond? Did he, for example, back off a bit on his foreign policy? Did he change the way that he looked at the world as a result of what he was getting from Nixon?
I think Reagan had his own mind on foreign policy, pretty much so. In fact, I think, as I point out in the book, there were some differences later in the 80s when Reagan was approaching Gorbachev on his changes in foreign policy, when he had the meetings in Geneva and then later in Reykjavik. I thought that Nixon thought, frankly, that Gorbachev might be taking some advantage of Reagan, that Reagan might not be tough enough for Gorbachev. But later, Nixon actually changed his mind and thought that Reagan was doing the right thing. Nixon was mostly concerned actually about George Shultz not having too much influence on Reagan. I mentioned that in the book, and I think very candidly, he felt that Weinberger was the stronger of the two leaders within the Reagan administration. But he didn't try to push that upon Reagan. The other influence I think he had on Reagan was in the '84 campaign, and we can get back into that if there's an opportunity to discuss that.
Sure. Well, what happened in the '84 campaign?
Well, in 1984, the campaign was going really well until our first debate with Mondale. That didn't go so well, and that was on October 7th with Mondale. And Reagan, there was some dispute over what happened in that, and I even disagreed with some of the analysts on that. I felt that Reagan was brutalized in his debate preparation and lost his self-confidence because he was prepared improperly. Others thought he hadn't studied enough, but I think I watched the debate preparation and I report in detail in the book, which is a very important part of that book. If you read it, that the way he was prepared was all in the wrong way. He had the wrong people working with him on it. But anyway, Mondale took him to the cleaners pretty much in that first debate, and Reagan had lost some of his self-confidence. It was at that point that Stu Spencer, his senior campaign strategist, made a suggestion and said, look, why don't you have Nixon write a memo to Reagan not just to give him advice, but he thought that Nixon would bolster Reagan's self-confidence by writing him a memo about the next debate that would be coming up, and that Reagan had such admiration and respect for Nixon that even if it wasn't quite obvious necessarily that Reagan would read any memo from Nixon that would bolster Reagan's confidence sort of subliminally going into that second debate with Mondale, that it would help him a lot. So Spencer, who was really a brilliant strategist, knew that something coming from Nixon, who had that very senior statesman-like political sense about him with Reagan, would give him that kind of confidence that would help him in that second debate.
Well, what was Reagan's reaction to that? Did he accept it willingly, or did he resent it in any way, or did he take the advice and move on it?
He didn't resent it at all, Warren. He didn't. He didn't communicate expressly on things like that necessarily, but you knew that he always had in the back of the mind such respect for Nixon. He wouldn't have, going back to Nixon's presidency, where right to the end he supported him all the way through on the Vietnam War. He supported him all the way through on Watergate. So you knew that he was a stalwart supporter and had great respect for Nixon. When the two of them met, that's the very last chapter in the book, which is such a fascinating story of where I call it the Lions Gather, where the two of them met, and I asked them how they first got to know each other, and it was when Nixon was on the House Un-American Activities Committee, and Reagan came to testify when he was at the Screen Actors Guild. But then later they got into more and more discussions about how they got to know each other, and Reagan talked about how the head of General Electric, when Reagan was doing working for General Electric, how the head of General Electric told Reagan, that before he got into politics, that Reagan, should go to Nixon for advice because Nixon could give him great advice. So if you think about it, back in the back in the early '60s, going back that far, Reagan knew that Nixon was someone that was sort of a wise person to give advice to him in his political career. Now, it wasn't necessarily written or spoken or said out loud, but you knew it was always in the back of Reagan's mind.
You say that Reagan was a guy who did not like confrontations with the staff. He had a lot of people competing with one another. You call them the power seekers. But
Yes.
there was somebody else in his campaign in his area that wasn't adverse to confrontations. And you have a chapter called Nancy Strikes Back. Tell us about that.
Well, President Reagan didn't like confrontation at all, and some people in his staff didn't serve him well, and that's going to surprise a lot of people that that the Reagan White House was not all rosy and all the people didn't get along all that well. He had some people within his staff that really didn't support his own agenda, and they were out for themselves in many ways. And that took place during the campaign in 1984 when some of the people on Reagan's staff didn't want Reagan to be very aggressive in dealing with. Well, let me step back just to say one thing. People don't see Reagan as necessarily being a tough guy or aggressive or competitive. But when it comes to campaigning, Reagan can drop that nice guy visage of himself, and he's very, very competitive, especially when he's under attack. And so this took place in 1984, especially when Mondale started attacking him really viciously, because Mondale was behind in late September and started attacking him. And he didn't want to, his staff, who had told him to lay back on attacking Mondale, well, he didn't want to tell the staff, hey, fellas, you don't want me to say anything about Mondale. So he left it up to Mrs. Reagan to be the tough guy in this process. And this led to a confrontation on Air Force One where I got caught in the middle between the president and Mrs. Reagan when she thought I was the culprit here of telling the president not to go after Mondale in his speeches, and when it wasn't, I wasn't the culprit. It was actually Jim Baker and his other people in his staff who didn't want Reagan attacking Mondale, and so it was left to me to Mrs. Reagan to carry the message to me and then to Jim Baker to, hey, it's time to go out, take the gloves off on Mondale, and that's a scene. That's a really good scene in the book, and that took place on Air Force One, and I really recommend people to read it.
It is a good scene, and there are a lot of good scenes in the book in addition to it. You're absolutely right about that. How do you think that Nixon and Reagan would feel about the current Republican incumbent of the White House? And do you think they would look at Donald Trump in different ways, or would they judge him the same way?
That's interesting. Nixon, I think Nixon would have some admiration in this sense. Nixon took a lot of hits. Nixon was dealt during his years in the White House. You have to remember he came into the White House faced with three headwinds. He had the Vietnam War, which he inherited from the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. He never had a Congress on his side. He had Democrats leading the Senate and the House for his entire 5.5 years, and he had an adversarial press the entire time. So I think if you want to look at it narrowly in this respect, I think Nixon would admire the feistiness that Trump views the way he deals with the press and is willing to fight back and deal with the media and his adversaries. And maybe Nixon wouldn't do it in the same way, but in sort of the generic sense, he would look at it and say, I think if I could have a conversation right now with him, he'd say, boy, that guy Trump really knows how to fight back, and I would admire that. Um, as for Reagan, um, I look back at the early days of our administration back in 1981, and I took a look at my my chapters in the book where we opened up in January of 1981. And the president said in that very first cabinet meeting, he said, we came here to do things differently. So again, if I try to look at it one narrow way, Reagan would say, you know, Trump is really making a lot of changes, and I wish I could have made a lot of more changes like the way he's doing it. Not in the same fashion, perhaps, but he's doing a lot of things that I wish I could have gotten done. And in 1981, January, in the first few cabinet meetings, the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, and 25th, all of them which I sat in on, Reagan was very exuberant about making big changes on reducing government, on reducing the bureaucracy, on making enormous changes in the size of government, and cutting back on waste, just the way Trump is doing now. But he couldn't get it done, and he wasn't very successful at it after a very few weeks and few months. And I think that, again, looking at that, he'd say, well, he's doing things that I would like to have gotten done. Now, his style would have been entirely different. That's again, going back to the sense that Reagan didn't like confrontation. So you're asking me how they would view him. They would view him outside the stylistic questions. They would have some admiration for the overall way way he approaches things, but not the stylistic way he does things.
President Trump and his new Secretary of Defense seem to have caused a lot of distress in Europe by suggesting that the United States might pull the military out, and also by apparently Trump is proposing to broker peace in Ukraine with Russia and not have Ukraine necessarily part of the action, or at least not at the beginning. What about those kinds of strategies and the way that we look upon Russia, and of course, is different from the Soviet Union that Reagan and Nixon had to do with together. But how would they feel about that? Do you think that they would be supportive of what he's doing?
I'm not certainly not an expert in this area, Warren, but I know that instinctively Reagan was in his heart and stomach and instinctively in gut, he was always he was still always an anti-communist. And that would, I think, be raw to him to give up any to give up in any way he'd be so upset at what Putin had done. It would bother him in a very dramatic way to give up any ground. I don't know how else to, I just don't know how to put it. Even when I worked with him on the speech before the General Assembly in 1985, when he wanted to soften his tone to the Soviets before the Geneva summit to try to make some headway with Gorbachev. But even after that speech, despite the fact that his policy decisions wanted to make some changes with the Soviet Union, he wrote me a note saying that he still liked the fact that he upset the ambassador because he said, I love the look on his face because I upset him. So in his gut, Reagan was always this stern anti-communist. Now, Nixon was much more realistic about it in the sense that I think he would try to find a way to leverage Putin to gain some kind of real leverage against him, and to not let Putin get any victory out of this, because he would see Putin saying any victory here would give him a next step into NATO, and that would be a very big disaster.
What about challenging creating constitutional challenges as President Trump has done, and appointing people to various positions, almost because it seemed that they weren't necessarily the right people for the job, and apparently trying to force the issue on his own political party, which Trump has been able to do. Is that something that they would admire?
I don't know. It's hard for me to go into their mindset.
Sure.
And determine, what they would think about that. Trump is Trump, and he's a unique personality. He's going to test the system. I think that a lot of the things he's doing is premised on some of the wounds he felt, that the grievances he's had over the last few years, and so he's testing the system. He's pushing the envelope as far as he can. And I can't make a reading on what Reagan or Nixon would say based on that. I can only say that some of these are very unique appointments. I don't think some of Biden's appointments were the greatest appointments in the world as well. I mean, putting in a mayor from Indiana as the head of the transportation department doesn't seem to me to be the soundest thing in the world. I don't think Xavier Becerra was the greatest HHS secretary. So it's, there's a lot of things I'd do differently if I were advising Joe Biden and his administration. So it's, I don't know how else to answer that question other than it's Trump being Trump.
I guess I want to know, I want to go to the audience and give them an opportunity to ask questions. But before I do, can you say how would you say that Nixon and Reagan were, how did they deal with the hardest things that they had to deal with? I guess I'm sorry, I'm not asking, it's not a very good question, but I think you can tell what I mean.
Nixon had to deal with his recovery from Watergate. That's the hardest thing he had to deal with. And I have to say this is, which I think people would find very interesting. I came to San Clemente probably 10 days after his resignation. I was 29 years old. I was very junior White House staffer, but I was known as one of the diehards who didn't want him to resign, and they needed help right when he resigned, and so they needed somebody to come help him out to get his finances squared away. They were after him for his income tax returns. They were trying to just bar him in 2 different states. He had no income. He obviously had no job. He was trying to put his life back together, and there I was for the first time having a face-to-face meeting with the president that I didn't have when I was a junior staff member. And there I was thrust into a head-to-head meeting with the former president. And he knew I was a loyalist, but here he was having his whole life stripped away from him. Everything he ever had wished for and wanted it in his entire career was taken away from him. And I went in there thinking, my gosh, he'd be down and out and low. And he said to me, he said, Ken, don't get down. We've got to look forward. We're going to get over this. We'll move forward. Don't look back. And I was just blown away. It was amazing how resilient he was. Right, this was in August of 1974, just 2 weeks after he had resigned the presidency, and so I think that was something that I can never forget about him. As for Reagan, I think the most difficult time for him that I dealt with was in 1985 when he had his first personal crisis of his presidency. It's a very, very important chapter in the book. Chapter 20. It is during what was called the Bitburg controversy when he went to Germany. It was to commemorate the anniversary of the end of World War II. And the advance team that was doing the preparations for the visit to Germany to where he was going to lay a wreath on the cemetery of some German soldiers had done the advance work in wintertime, and the cemetery had been covered with snow. And it turned out that the headstones of the cemetery were the headstones of these worst German Waffen SS soldiers. And when the snow melted, it was discovered that who they were, and this enormous controversy erupted that here Reagan was going to go bestow some kind of service on these horrible Nazi Waffen SS soldiers. And this, they didn't want him to go, and it was on the eve of the Holocaust commemorations, and the Congress didn't want him to go, and the newspapers erupted, and stories all over television and headlines. And it was a personal crisis. His poll ratings dropped, and I got called in from California as an emergency aide by Mrs. Reagan and by the president to help him out of this. And they set up a speech at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp to try to atone for this huge mistake they had made in the advance work. So that was the time, I think, was this big personal time in his life that he had been, at least the first time I had been faced with him. And it turned out that we retrieved it. He delivered what has been called the greatest speech in his greatest speech of his life, actually. And it was a collaboration between the two of us, and it worked out for the best. And I hope people read this chapter 20. It's a very dramatic chapter.
Let me go to the chat session, and I'm told that several people want to take issue with you about Biden's cabinet appointments, putting him on a par with Trump's selections, and they're asking, what about appointing somebody who's supposed to take apart the very department that she's being appointed to, and is that a different kind of thing? And anyway, they wanted me to raise that issue.
Which one? Which department is that?
The Department of Education. Trump has said that he's appointed a woman who he would like to see dissolve that department. Well,
we'll see what happens. Again, it's look. There should be no surprises. I mean, Trump said a lot of things in the campaign that people voted for, and he said he was going to do it. Now, we have to admit that the education in this country is not standing up to what it's supposed to be. So I don't think anybody should be happy with standards of education in this country. Test scores throughout the country have been very low, and the education department hasn't exactly delivered. So maybe something has to be done dramatically to change the Department of Education. Now, whether it means getting rid of the Department of Education, I don't know if that's going to happen. But maybe some shock treatment there is something that's going to be necessary to change the direction of what happens and get the bureaucrats there thinking a little bit differently about how we educate our children. I don't think that's such a bad thing.
We have a feisty audience tonight. Several people have asked, it sounds like you're saying boys will be boys when you say Trump is being Trump. What about January 6th? And was that really an insurrection?
Well, I don't think it was an insurrection as defined by the words, but I think it was a riot. And I don't think it was the right thing that should have happened. And if you want me to defend what happened on January 6th, I'm not going to defend it. But I don't think it was an insurrection words are important to me, and it was not an attempt to take over the United States government.
Okay, let me get to another one. Victor wants to know, he's curious about your observation about Reagan's and Nixon's intellectual capacity and pursuits. Were they readers? Did they know and or study history?
Yeah, well, both of them were great intellectuals in different ways. Nixon was a great reader. He read, studied, he wrote, he studied all the time. He had great intellect. From the time he started in Congress, he was a great traveler. He traveled the world, and work was his great passion. That was his how he spent his time, it was his recreation. Reagan was surprising to people. He was a great reader himself. He spent all those times when he worked for General Electric and traveled the country. All those times alone in his hotel room, he was reading newspaper articles, reading books, studying history, and writing and reading. So they're both intellects in a quite different way, but they were both very interesting men, and they studied, and Reagan studied economics a great deal, and you'll find that when you read my book, where from time to time he would stop meetings that we would have in the Oval Office and give us lectures on economics.
Susan wants to know, would either Nixon or Reagan express approval of what Musk is doing, Elon Musk, acting as a sort of unelected co-president?
Well, again, you're asking me to read their minds, but I do think, I will say this about Reagan. I think Reagan would approve of ways to shake up what's going on in the federal government. Now, whether it's precisely the way Elon Musk is doing it or not, but he would really approve of what is being done to shake up what's going on. As I said, the first thing Reagan said when he came in the cabinet meeting on January 22nd, he said, "We came here to do things differently." And I think he would agree that it's time to do things differently. And I think he was so disappointed. We had a meeting that I described in the book in June of 1981, where I came to meet with him at Camp David. And he said he was he was already discouraged and disappointed with his own staff. He said, Ken said, the fellows aren't here to help me. They don't have the same sense of the crusade that I do. So he was already disappointed with his own staff. They didn't have the same feeling of the mission that he did, to have a crusade to change America. So I think that he would have a feeling that at least there's a sense of mission here to change how things work. And Reagan complained about the Washington buddy system, how that you come into office or you look at Washington and nobody ever changes things. It's the same thing over and over again. It's the same, and that's the way that question about the education department. Unless you shake things up, nothing's going to change.
Bruce wants to know this. Would Nixon have been surprised about the Supreme Court's so-called immunity decision? Do you think if he knew the ruling, he would have resigned? Not quite sure about the second part of the question, but what about the idea that the Chief Justice wrote that, or opined that if the president committed a crime when as long as he was doing his work as president, he wouldn't have to be prosecuted for it?
Well, there's several different questions in there. I will say this: if we had the kind of media we have now, if the media had not been dominated back, if we had a different media, if we had the kind of media back then that we have now, which was diverse. If we had, let's say, a Fox News, if we had cable, more cable, if we had podcasts, if we had the internet, if we had the kind of support we could have ginned up, I think Nixon would have put on a better fight, and he might not have ever resigned.
Here's a question from
That's gonna
Ben.
stir up some people.
Well, excuse me, are you not finished? I didn't interrupt you, did I? Okay. Ben wants to know, while there are other presidents in U.S. history who retaliated against those who were critical, do you agree that the scale of Trump's, quote, revenge, close quote, politics and the openness of Trump's intent to seek revenge is greater than past instances? And I guess you would say greater than Nixon and Reagan particularly.
I don't think that you can add a gradation to that. Look, when I mentioned this to you earlier before we got on the air here that Jack Kennedy wiretapped these steel companies, and when he got into disputes with them, he took their tax returns. He sicked the IRS on Jimmy Hoffa when he was after him. Franklin Roosevelt tried to pack the Supreme Court. There are instances of former presidents doing very tough things. Jack Kennedy sicked the FBI on the steel companies. He retaliated against the press when he was in disagreement with them. I don't think that you can. There are gradations. Once you cross the line, you've crossed the line. So either you can't say that there's a little bit. You can't be a little bit pregnant when you start retaliating against your adversaries. So there's no small sense of a grievance in that department. So I'm not going to say that one president is purer than the other in this respect.
Jim wants to know, do you think that Reagan's economic policies led the U.S. to the income inequality that we have today?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I think if you look at I think the Great Society and the so-called war on poverty has led to income inequality. It's as Reagan said about the war on poverty, poverty won. It's gotten worse and worse ever since 1965 and the so-called Great Society. I don't think you can defend what has been done. The welfare state has gotten worse since the welfare state has grown under Democratic administrations. So I don't think income inequality has gotten worse under Ronald Reagan.
Dorothea wants to know, can you compare the Republican Party of today with the Republican Party of the Nixon-Reagan years? And what do you think of the path that the present administration is taking?
Well, that has changed mainly in terms of degree and because of the media has changed a lot of things, Warren. The principles are the same. The principles of the party are unchanged. The principles of the party are anti-taxes, anti-regulation, anti-big government. It's it's for a strong national defense, a strong foreign policy. It's for closed borders. Those policies haven't changed between the Republican Party of Nixon and Reagan and the Republican Party of today. What has changed is that you have a whole different media structure. Back then you had the 3 television networks, 2 wire services, 3 news weeklies, a few major newspapers, and now you have a whole different media structure that exaggerates the differences and exacerbates the differences and intensifies differences between the parties. And I would look, I don't think the Democrat Party today has any resemblance to the Democrat Party of Hubert Humphrey or Jack Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson or Walter Mondale. I think a lot of it has to do with the intensity of American politics today.
Well, do you think the media is principally responsible for that, or the politicians themselves? It used to be in those days they could argue in courtrooms and in legislative chambers, but then they could have a drink at night. But they don't do that anymore.
Well, I think we can still do it. It's just that our the culture, it's not just. I'm not blaming the media. It's just the sources of the media have changed. We have so much more. I mean, you pick up your iPhone or your iPad, and there's so much intensity. There's something ringing on it constantly. There's so many different sources of information, and the anger level is so intense. It's not just listening to Brinkley and David Brinkley or Walter Cronkite on the news now. It's you've got you pick up Morning Joe and you listen to Joe Scarborough. You're so angry in the morning. I mean, you can't even have a cup of coffee without having somebody spewing anger at you in the morning. So it's that sort of level of intensity that I think turns off everybody and just sets off the level of politics. I can still, I could, when this is all over, I wouldn't mind having a cigar with Zev and a cognac with him, and we could talk politics all night. We can disagree about Trump and disagree about Karen Bass or whatever we can do, but we need to do it out of the level, away from the intensity of the glare that politics has taken, that we see basically through the lens of what has brought upon us through the internet and through cable, through all the different news sources we have today. Warren, it's just changed. It's changed totally from what we had over the last generation.
I couldn't disagree with that at all. Diana wants to know, would Nixon or Reagan have sidelined Congress, especially with regard to the power of the purse? I guess there's an assumption there that Trump has sidelined him in some way. I don't know how else to interpret that question.
Well, Nixon did a little bit with the Impoundment Act of 1974. There's going to be always some disputes of that kind, and they do have a way of counteracting each other at the end of the day. And our democracy still works, and we do tend to think the sky is falling, and when the sky is not falling, and we tend to worry too much about when people worry about the end of democracy. It's not going to ever end. It's just that we need it tends to settle. Things need to tend to settle down in the end. But I don't think what happens is that the Congress will write the executive and the courts will write the legislative, and the executive will write the Congress, and that's why we have three branches of government at the end of the day.
Phil has a question that raises issues about I think the assumptions that you're making. He says, what do you see as the future of the Republican Party? Will it return to the traditional conservatism approach of Nixon and Reagan, or will MAGA be the way of the future GOP? You said that the party still seems to you to be somewhat similar to what it was before. A lot of people are saying that it's just utterly and completely different.
Well, the Trump or MAGA or whatever you want to call it, a lot of it was a reaction to the cultural upheaval of what happened to the United States in the last 10 to 15 years. And I think that the culture changes sort of overcame what Joe Kraft, you remember Joe Kraft, the journalist, referred to as the forgotten man. And that was Donald Trump and the MAGA movement was a reaction to the massive cultural upheaval that took place and he reacted to it, and the movement reacted to it. And it will, like water, it will find its own level once again, and things will probably quiet down. But I think, you know, there's a great change there's a great difference between the two coasts. When you go to flyover country, people have a very different attitude about what changes are taking place in the country, and different attitudes toward it. And the level of concern in some of your audience about what's happening in Washington is not they don't have the same concern as some of the folks that are asking these questions do, because they feel that things had gone so far culturally and politically and to the left and in sort of crazy directions. There had to be some correction taking place. Now, that's what happens. That's what happened probably in the New Deal. It happened in the Reagan Revolution, and that's what happened during when Trump came in. And so this is what happened when great movements take over.
Here's another specific foreign policy question. Phil wants to know if Reagan and Nixon were strong supporters of NATO, how would they understand Trump, who seems to be turning his back on NATO?
I don't know if he's turning his back. I think he's saying that the NATO countries have to start pulling their own weight. I think he's taunting them in a way and saying, look, the U.S. is taking on too much of its obligation in NATO. And I'm saying as president that, look, you can't have America carry the entire burden of what's going on in the world. And so you as NATO countries have to bear your share of the burden financially of what's going on. And as a NATO alliance, we have all have a responsibility here. So you can't all depend on America to pay the full price of the defense costs that are taking place. So I don't think he's saying no to NATO. I think he's saying, look, we all have to share our burden.
Well, it's wonderful to have had you on this program. And again, here's the book. It's called Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. And Ken Khachigian, thanks so much for joining us and being so willing to express your own views in addition to what you were reporting in the book about Reagan and Nixon. It's a fascinating book, and even if you don't agree with Ken's ideas, it seems to me it is very much worth a read. So, Ken, thank you very much for being on the program.
The book is not a political book. The book is a history book. So
that's true.
It's. I hope people will pick it up. It's a history that takes place, and there's a lot of interesting stories. It's not a book of advocacy, and Warren, I think you'll agree. It's a book about a history that takes place that they'll find fascinating. Talk about those years that took place and stories that they'll never get anywhere else.
Ken Khachigian, I think you're right. The stories are not anywhere else, and they are numerous and fascinating. Thanks again so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Okay. We want to remind everybody that the next program will be on Tuesday, February 18th at 5 o'clock. Former U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, Joyce Vance, in conversation with Pat Morrison. The American Justice System, Testing the Limits is the title of that program. Hope you listen to it. Thanks for being with us tonight, and have a good evening.